Hello, my name is Nathan Swift. I'm a Security Cloud Solution Architect here at Microsoft. In this video, we'll be examining part 4 of our security automation using a logic app to look at a alert and then notify anyone that was involved with that Azure resource in our audit logs. So in part 4 here today, we're going to be examining and building out the last action steps. Those will include a for each loop and then actually sending an email. So let's dive right into that. So what you'll see here is the security automation template, which we discussed in part 1 of the video. And we kind of built out the logic. So in this case, we're going to go ahead and update it a little bit. So rather than filtering on the caller ID, we're going to, in our for each loop, append the caller into a string variable. And then in that for each loop, we'll do some conditional checking as well. And just so that we make sure that as we're going through each Azure activity event, if we find a unique email address, we want to keep that email address unique and not keep adding the same type of email address if it was in the audit events a few times. So let's go ahead and look into this and keep building this out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and switch over into our Logic App Designer. Now remember, we want to kind of keep 2 tabs open. One is the history so that we can look at the raw data or the raw outputs if needed. So for instance, we may want to look for a particular field called caller and take that email address from the caller for each audit event occurring. And so what we're going to do is we're going to switch back to the design view. And in the designer, we're going to go ahead and create a new step here. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to build another variable. So we're going to initialize a variable here. And we're going to initialize the variable as a string. This is going to contain our unique email addresses in there. And we're going to go ahead and give this a name. We'll call it active caller email address. Active caller email address. And for now, what we'll do is we'll go ahead and we'll give it a null expression. So for now, we're going to initialize the variable. It's going to contain nothing in it. And remember, in the last step, we want to rename each of these actions so that it's easier to find that information and read it a little bit when people are looking at what this logic app or the actions are involved in. So initialize the variable active caller email address. All right, so now that we have a blank variable, we're going to want to go ahead and for our next step, if we look back, we had a nice set of audit logs that came back from 14 days ago. That's where we were using our current time and past time and then passing it into a API call so that we didn't have any dependencies on the Azure activity logs being sent to Azure Microsoft Sentinel or being sent to a log analytics workspace to kind of use a KQL query. We just want to directly call the Azure Activity API. So back to here, our next step is going to actually involve what we call a control here. And we'll let this populate here. So we're going to choose control, and we're going to choose a for each loop. So we're going to select an output from one of the previous steps, and our output is going to be the body of the get audit logs here. All right. So for that body, we're going to go ahead and do another control as well. And this time we're actually going to use a condition And we're going to conditionally check for a couple things. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to check for a unique email address in each audit event. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and look at this a little bit further. So we're going to say something like, in the items of the for each loop, so for each item, we're going to specifically look at the caller field. All right. And if that caller field contains an @ symbol, so this is a quick way we can filter and do a conditional check to make sure that as we're looking for the callers, for instance, we're not going to try to pick up a caller that's got like a managed service identity in the audit logs or an Azure Active Directory service principal that would be like an app ID. We're not going to email like an app ID or a managed service identity, right? Because those don't really have email addresses. All right, so we're also going to add one more condition. So we're going to add another row here. You'll notice here we can add additional groups and change how we want to do the conditional checkup with an and or an or several ands or and ands. It's really kind of neat, the logic that you can use in a very low code, no code environment here. So I'm just going to delete that group back out. And so the second thing that we want to do is we want to take that variable, active email addresses, and we want to make sure that it does not contain the caller that is being called. So again, we want to look for items, and we'll say with the for each loop and caller. And so what we're trying to say here is, look, check for a unique email address by looking at the current item and the caller field. Make sure that it contains an @ symbol, which would indicate an email address. And in addition, make sure that the variable that we're going to append to in just a moment, the active caller email addresses, a string variable, does not contain the current caller that we're looking at in this audit event. So this will make sense in just a second here. So what we're going to say is, if that statement is true, we're going to go ahead and add an action here, and we're going to use variables. In this case, we're going to append to a string variable. And now that we're going to append to a string variable, we'll go ahead and choose our active caller email addresses. And we're going to append the caller that was in there. So again, we're going to use items, and we're going to use the for each loop, and we're going to use the caller field for each item. And we're going to go ahead and do a space here and a semicolon, right? So if we think about this, what's going to be happening here is, as we're going through the audit logs, we're going to get things like someone at someone.com, and we're going to append into the string variable. And so then in the next audit log, if it is someone at someone.com, we're going to make that a false statement. And if it's a false statement, we're just going to skip and keep going through each audit event. But if the audit event has a caller like caller B at someone.com, we're going to go ahead and append that caller B at someone.com with a space and semicolon. So we're using these semicolons because, like in a email that we're going to send in Office 365, in a to field or in a CC field, it will recognize each unique email address, and the semicolon will separate those unique email addresses. So we're going to go ahead and we'll see that test out here very shortly. So now that we've got our conditional email checks, I'm going to go ahead and, again, kind of best practices, put some information in here. So I'm going to add a comment in the for each loop, and we'll say something like running through the get audits body. Of audit events, and we'll check if email address is unique, and append to a string variable to be used in the to send an email. All right. Now we'll add some additional comments as well too here. So we'll add a comment just talking a little bit more. These are kind of notes for either someone that wants to use the Logic app later, or just wants to kind of decipher what these each of these actions are doing. So we'll go ahead and do a conditional check. Prevents the same email address from being appended to email address string variable. All right. And then finally, we're going to just comment here about if the statement was true. And we'll say something like append the unique email address to string variable to be used in the to field of sending email. All right. So we got some nice comments. Let's go ahead and let's just hit the save button here. Save our work. And now the last step. So our last step after we go through a loop of all those audit events is we're going to send the email. So we're going to choose Office 365 here. And we're going to go into Outlook, Office 365 Outlook, and we're going to scroll through here. There should be a nice one that says send an email v2. We could also send an email with options. So we could send an email with some options that say something to the effect of, hey, we noticed some activities on the resource. And this type of security alert, threat protection alert came up on the resource. Did you happen to generate this alert with some activity that you were doing in our activity logs? Can we correlate this? By doing that, can you reply back to the email and let the security operations team know? Or maybe you're replying back to the email will update some notes in a ServiceNow ticket or into a Jira ticket system. Maybe update something like Microsoft Sentinel's incident. In this case, our whole notify on the Azure Defender alert, on the alert itself by the activity logs, there really isn't kind of notes or incident notes or any kind of ticket notes. There is a security alert in Azure Defender, and that security alert can be opened or dismissed. So We'll talk a little bit more maybe in another video about incidents and security alerts in an active or dismissed state. So what we'll do here is instead is we'll just go ahead and we'll send an email v2. And we're going to see that it's going to take... it will typically prompt you for a login or take your security context. In this case, it's taking a mailboxed user, I think, that already existed out there. And so it referenced that and was able to do it rather than prompting us to authenticate with a mailbox. The typical experience will be a prompt for an authenticated mailbox, or if the user account where you're building the logic app has a mailbox, it will authenticate and bring that in. And so you can always change those connections. And you can find those kind of connections back in the resource group of where you're building that logic app. And so we can go ahead and do grouping by type. And we can see here I've got like a bunch of logic apps, in here. So I'm going to see a bunch of these like API connections. But we could see that there are definitely some API connections that get created or that get referred to, right, based off of that Office 365 email. So I'm going to go ahead and switch back to the to field. Okay, so in our to field, right, we are going to use the variable for the active email addresses. And we'll do a space semicolon. And then we're also going to want to not just notify the folks that were recently modifying, starting the VM, modifying the VM, connecting to the VM in our audit logs. We're going to also want to notify the security operations team, which would be a different set of email addresses that probably wouldn't be found in the audit logs. And so we're going to go up here into this area called parameters. Now, this name's a little misleading a bit. Parameters are basically global variables. So if I choose, again, this is going to look like a variable. It's a global variable that can be called again. And it's also a global variable when we go to deploy this as an ARM template. We can prompt and ask the person to deploy this logic app to enter their security operations email. So we'll call this security operations email. And then we'll go ahead and we'll give it an email address here. And so what we'll do here is we'll just use josh@Microsoft.com. Now, typically this will be a distribution list for your security operations team. I don't have one handy in Azure in my Azure Active Directory tenant, but we would kind of do that. Operations email. All right. And so now this is a little tricky too. Sometimes you'll see some kind of strange things in the designer UI of Logic apps. There is no like save button here. And so it's not this X button, but it's actually, it may be this X button that closes it. Perfect. So if I go back to parameters, there we go. I could add some additional global parameters, but we probably won't need those. So now if I go back here, I'll see parameters under the dynamic content. And now I can add the security operations email. One thing to note too is I can, in the action of sending an email, I can do some additional things. So maybe I need to attach a file to it. Maybe I need to add a CC field. For us, we're going to just add an importance here and make this very high on our alert here. Now, here comes the subject line we want to use and the HTML body. So we get full HTML. We could even go to like an HTML editor and play with an HTML editor to build kind of like a template. For the purposes of this security automation, though, we're going to do a little trick here. So I'm going to go back to my Azure portal. I'm actually going to create a resource again. And I'm going to go ahead and create a logic app here. And in this logic app, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and create a blank logic app. And so we'll just call this RG blank. And then we're going to go ahead and make this consumption blank app. This isn't really too important because I'm going to ultimately delete this, but I'm going to use this as a reference here. So I'm going to go ahead and create this logic app here. It will take just hopefully right around a minute or so to go. And we'll go to the logic app. It's going to, since it's a blank logic app and there's no actions, it's immediately going to go to the designer page here. And we're going to not necessarily cheat, but we're going to actually look for this. And so there are templates in logic apps here, which are really kind of cool. We kind of skipped over that in the first and second part, but we could use something here in the third part. So what I can do is I can look for a category, and let me switch to security. And lo and behold, we actually have security based off of Azure Security Center and Azure Defender, now called Microsoft Defender for Cloud. But we can take one of these, get a notification email when Security Center creates a recommendation, regulatory compliance, when we detect a threat. So I'm going to choose this template, and I'm going to go ahead and use this template. All right, after some troubleshooting, I think we've got this going. So we're actually logged in as the mailbox user, and we're using the security template to notify us when we detect a threat. So let's go ahead and use this template. Now, logged in as the mailbox user, we're going to go ahead and it would prompt us to authenticate. I've already went ahead and done this. Give us a little link here to create also the Security Center alert. So I'm going to hit continue here. And here's a very nice template. So what I can do is I can go ahead and copy this subject over here, and we'll use this in the designer for our subject. And then we'll go ahead and we'll actually grab this HTML body, Control C, and we should be able to paste this guy directly in here. There we go. So Azure Security Center has discovered a potential security threat in your environment. Details below. We'll get the trigger body display name, the attacked resource is the compromised entity, severity, time generated, description, vendor name, the alert ID, and then a link to view the alert in Azure Security Center. And so we'll just change some of this verbiage here. So the alert in Microsoft Defender for Cloud. This was a recent change. This is recorded a week after Ignite, so some of the product names did change a little bit. The same functionality is there, and is actually been increased in some different ways. We'll have kind of maybe another video here in a bit about some of those changes at Ignite. So we've got Microsoft in your environment. Okay, so we've updated the verbiage a little bit. And so let's go ahead and save this guy. And all right, here we go. We're going to go back into the Logic app, and we're going to look at the history. And we're going to go ahead and resubmit here. And now we're going to kick off another job. And now it's troubleshooting time. This can be very common when you're building Logic apps. You're going to, as you're building them, think you got it working, and then you're going to run into something here. So in this case, we're saying the execution of the template action for each failed. The result of the evaluation for each expression at the body get audits is of type object. The result must be a valid array. Okay, interesting. So we're going to go back to our audits. We're going to look at the raw output of those audits. Okay, so we called body, which is a JSON object. However, in a for each loop, right, it's not going to be a for each loop of JSON objects. It's for each loop's got to use an array, so we're actually looking for brackets in JSON. So we're actually going to say the value. So this is where those two tabs come in really handy. We're going to go back here. We're going to go back into our for each loop, and then in the body get audits, we're going to say something a little bit different, right? So we're going to say we're going to use an expression, and we're going to use an expression of the body, and it's called get audits. So we're referring back to the name that we gave that HTTP call. So the output body of get audits. And then instead of doing just the body, we're going to go ahead and call value. And value is this guy here, which is the array. And within the array, we have different events, right? Events that have occurred. So let's go ahead and let's hit the OK button. Go ahead and hit save here. And now back to our test again. So we're going to go ahead and resubmit, refresh. All right, excellent. We're going to click in and kind of troubleshoot or watch this history in semi-real time, right? So you see here, right, we've got 53 different audit events over that 14-day period, right? Current time, past time, 14 days ago, and we've got 53 events. Now, when you're working with like arrays and for each loops, sometimes you may just want to hit refresh here at the top. There we go. So don't be afraid when you're doing kind of like a run history to hit the refresh button. Sometimes the portal doesn't auto update itself, and so sometimes it's just good to hit the refresh button a few times to get that. All right, excellent. So we can see here some of that logic, right? Check for a unique email address. So here's a unique email address, append to the string. Let's go into the next audit event. And the next audit event. And we're probably going to have to change some of the logic up here because I have a feeling that our conditions are not quite working the way we want them to. So there's the email address that was sent. Let's see here. Eagle, Chris, Eagle. Yeah, so that's definitely not good in that sense here. So we can even see a gap in between that. So we got to troubleshoot this a little bit. Our logic is just a little off, right? So if we go here, yeah, we've got duplicates, right? We don't want duplicates. We want unique email addresses. So, let's take a look at this. Let's see here. So for each item, we're going to check for the unique email address. Let's think through this logic here for a second. We're doing items for each caller. It's going to contain an @ symbol. And we're going to say that the active caller email address variable, that string of variables we're appending into, that it does not contain the caller. should be correct. Let me test something here. I wonder if we go to the append string variable, we've got a space and then the semicolon. Let's delete that space and put the space after the semicolon here. Go ahead and save this guy out. And then we'll resubmit one more time here. And then go into the history here. And I almost wonder too if there's a, not necessarily a race condition, but we'll take a look at something here as well too. So there we go, bringing in eagle. But then we're bringing in eagle again. Yeah. Something here is not adding up with the conditional check. So let's look at one more thing here. We're going to go back to the designer. And I wonder, so in a for each loop, right, in logic apps, we're going to hit the three little ellipses here. This is where, right, we renamed different actions. We also added comments around the logic app. There's also under the three little ellipses, right, like if something were to fail, you could say, hey, if something upstream fails, and continue and should run after it. Typical default behavior is successful, but maybe you're lazy, right? And I'm certainly lazy myself, and you want to say, hey, I don't want to really fix this problem with an error. Go ahead and continue running if I do get an error upstream from an action or if it's timed out. Continue the logic app steps. So that can be very helpful. But what particularly we want to look at, because this is a for each loop, we can go into settings. And there is this concept of concurrency control. So, and it even tells us right here, by default, the for each iterations run at the same time or in parallel, right? This is parallelism. So that means that we're going to just execute this really fast. I'll push this through, push this array of data through for each, and do those things, those conditional checks. So I'm wondering if we change on concurrency control, and then to run this sequentially, each audit event, rather than all at the same time, we'll go ahead and change this degree of parallelism to 1. And we'll hit done here, and then we'll go ahead and hit save. So now we've changed this for each loop to, instead of doing all the events and do the conditional checks all at once, we're going to do it for each item, and the degree of parallelism is just 1 at a time. So let's go ahead and just resubmit here. Let's go ahead and refresh this guy. And then we're going to go ahead and refresh in the history. And we can already see a big difference, right? So where it took previously like about 10 seconds to run this logic app through the 53 items, right? It's taking a little bit longer. It actually took 16 seconds. So let's take a quick look at this. Send an email address. Chris, Josh. Okay, this is looking a lot better now. So it wasn't necessarily that space in the variable, append to string variable. It was more our degrees of parallelism in the for each loop that was causing the conditional checks to kind of like not work the way we wanted it to. So this is good news, right? So this means that conditionally we are checking, right? And then here we go. So the expression now is false on the second audit event, which was had the same caller address as Eagle. So on the second one, it's no longer unique. So now we know our check for unique email address, conditional check, and lookup is working correctly. Now there might be something slight. I'll have to probably research a little bit offline. But as we're going through here, it did seem to pick up some type of caller, but the caller didn't seem to come through. Or maybe it's on the last item in that for each loop and appending the way we're appending. Maybe that's causing it. I'll do a little bit of research offline. Try to figure that out, fix that up. Because before we send this to a GitHub repository at Microsoft, we just want this stuff to run really smooth and really well. So, yeah, I'll just have to kind of go through one by one just to see where we are. That's another trick here too. So you'll see, rather than next, clicking through that, you can quickly say, hey, I need to look at 52 of 53. Click out of it. And now we're at these, at this spot here where we were at, spot 2 or 3. So, yeah, it's just be a matter of finding that last guy here where the expression was true, just to see where we are. Yeah, and this will be a little bit of like paint drying, just kind of clicking through here. So with that, I'm not going to record me going through here and kind of debugging and troubleshooting this. Maybe I'll do a YouTube video or a session on like troubleshooting logic apps. That's also very helpful, just knowing where to look for certain things and how to kind of think about that stuff. So I hope this has been really helpful. We are now towards that end of that tunnel. We're at the end of these sessions. We have one more session left where we're going to be talking about taking the logic app, exporting the logic app, making it a generic so that we can deploy this via an ARM template. And while we're doing that, we'll be able to then send that template that deploys the logic app so it can receive inputs from the person deploying it. We'll go ahead and post that out on GitHub. So Microsoft Defender for Cloud's GitHub has a workflow automation folder and area, and we'll go ahead and upload a new thing. So you'll see that whole process, how to do that. Very easy once you see it. I kind of use some tools like GitHub Desktop and Visual Studio Code. You'll see it here in the next session. It's not that hard. It's actually pretty easy once you see it, kind of the process of mapping it. And hopefully in the last session, and if you've been following along, you'll be able to start building your own logic apps, your own security automation using logic apps for Microsoft Sentinel, for Microsoft Defender for Cloud. Maybe it's a timer-driven approach like we were talking about earlier in the series, or a trigger approach from a webhook from another system. And you'll be uploading your own security automations here very soon. So thank you and have a wonderful day.